Well, good morning, everyone. Very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. This report is the culmination of many months' hard work looking at the teaching of RSE in post-primary schools. This is the report of the Commission, just to make that clear. We were assisted by independent experts who analysed evidence received, but they reported to us and we made the final decision. I'm proud of this report. I'm proud of the team who did the work on this report within the Commission and who put so much effort into what I think, but we'll hear what you think at the end, what I think is a very balanced, accurate, fair report. So I'm not going to take up your time because two people who've been instrumental in putting this together and advising the Commission are, you're going to hear from Lauren Shaw and Colin Kaki. I think Colin's going first. We do want to leave a lot of time because I suspect you have questions, so we're going to leave time at the end for Q&A and we'll make sure all three of us are available for that. So I'll speak to you again at the end.
The title of today's report is A Compelling Case for Reform. We note that there have been a number of reports highlighting the need for reform of the policy framework in Northern Ireland governing relationship and sexuality education. In particular, the Gillen report into the prosecution of serious sexual offences and the Marshall report into child sexual exploitation. The Commission has benefited from the findings and analysis included in these reports, and we see our report as following in a consistent thread of analysis which has demonstrated that the case for reform is compelling, and we have concluded that the time to act is now. In this short presentation, I will just set out the context in which we launched our investigation report and the context that we now find ourselves within. The Commission launched this investigation with a specific focus on the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women's Recommendation 86D. This emerged from its 2018 inquiry report into sexual and reproductive health rights in Northern Ireland. This recommendation was uniquely incorporated into UK law by way of the Northern Ireland Executive Formation Act 2019. And Professor Bryce Dixon has highlighted that this is an extremely rare example of a legislature giving domestic effect to the view of an international human rights treaty body. In a dualist state, such as the UK, it is even more rare. However, Section 9.1 of the 2019 Act could not be more explicit in requiring the Secretary of State to ensure that the recommendations in paragraphs 85 and 86 of the CEDAW report are implemented in respect of Northern Ireland. This is the legal context in which we undertook this investigation. And we have set out in detail in our report the human rights standards which informs our analysis of the duties placed on the Secretary of State. The political context in which we launched our investigation was one in which the Northern Ireland Assembly was operating as envisaged by the Northern Ireland Act. Over the past few months, that has not been the case. And as we note in our report, this has made the process of conducting this investigation more complicated and has contributed to a lack of reasoned consideration of measures required to bring about implementation. As we have set out in our recommendations chapter, there would have been significant advantages to the Department of Education bringing forward the necessary reforms in the Northern Ireland Assembly. However, when Parliament placed a duty on the Secretary of State to ensure the implementation of recommendations 85 and 86, they required him to execute this duty expeditiously. With the passage of time and given the seriousness of the issues at stake, we consider that the compelling case for reform mean that the time for action is now, and as a result we recommend in our recommendations chapter that the Secretary of State begins actions. Our investigation report covers developments up to the 31st of January of this year, and we acknowledge that there have been a number of significant developments since this date, including the Education Training Inspectorate's investigation report into the preventative curriculum in schools. The findings of this report in many ways attune with our own findings, in particular the findings that too many schools avoid completely or cover with insufficient depth and progression many of the more sensitive aspects of the RSE aspect of the preventative curriculum. These include teaching on gender and sexual identity, LGBTQ+, sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation, domestic abuse and violence, and menstrual wellbeing. The ETI also report that pupils would like to know more on key sensitive issues, in particular gender identity and LGBTQ+. The finding that the teaching workforce feels ill-equipped to take forward the delivery of a progressive preventative curriculum in an integrated and consistent way to the level sought by pupils underscores our findings relating to the capacity of schools and teachers. In its report, the ETI raised a concern that viewing issues related to RSE in isolation may lead to schools becoming overwhelmed. The Commission shares this concern, which highlights the need to ensure the provision of RSE in our schools is addressed in a comprehensive manner. And this underscores the need for the Department of Education to take a lead in working with schools and other stakeholders to ensure adequate provision of RSE. We also acknowledge the continued work of the CCEA in reviewing and updating the RSE Hub and Progression Framework. With emerging issues and threats to child safety, it is important that resources are refreshed and reviewed. Throughout our investigation, it was emphasised to us that one of the positive features of the policy framework governing the curriculum is the flexibility which it affords schools to respond to emerging issues. In this context, it is vital that schools have access to resources and supports to ensure they are able to deliver comprehensive RSE which responds to contemporary issues. It would be remiss of us not to acknowledge the budgetary cuts which the Department of Education has been required to make and their implications for schools. The Commission appreciates that these cuts will inevitably have consequences for the delivery of our recommendations, and the Commission considers that it is important not to lose sight of the valuable contribution which comprehensive RSE provision can make to the protection of children's fundamental human rights. The most significant development of all since the end of our investigatory period of course, came last week, with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland laying down the Relationships and Sexuality Education Northern Ireland Amendment Regulations 2023 in Parliament. These regulations will amend the Education Minimum Content Order to require pupils in Key Stages 3 and 4 to receive age-appropriate, comprehensive and scientifically accurate education on sexual and reproductive health and rights covering prevention of early pregnancy and access to abortion. The Commission welcomes this legislative development. Indeed, it broadly addresses our recommendations for law reform. Early in this investigation, the Commission came to the conclusion that an amendment to the Minimum Content Order was required to ensure all children in Northern Ireland receive comprehensive RSE. The introduction of the regulations will do this and bring the focus on recommendations 3 to 14 of our report relating to implementation and monitoring. The regulations confer a duty on the Department of Education, Northern Ireland, to issue guidance on the delivery of relationship and sexuality education in grant-aided schools. We anticipate that this guidance will provide schools with further detail on how they can meet the new requirements set down in the curriculum, and the Commission stands ready to provide advice to the Department of Education on the content of the guidance. The regulations also place a duty on the Department to make provision about the circumstances in which a pupil may be withdrawn from elements of sexuality education. In this regard, we know that the UNCRC Committee, in its concluding observations to the UK of last month, recommended against parents being entitled to opt their children out of RSE. The Commission has not made specific recommendations relating to withdrawal. Within its equality screening document on the regulations, the Northern Ireland Office discussed alternative approaches adopted in England and in Wales respectively. And as we discussed in our report, there have been litigation on those measures. This is an issue on which there will be a divergence of views, but I'm sure we can all agree that we need to ensure that those arrangements do not empower abusers to prevent a child from realising that they are or have been the victim of abuse. And the Commission will provide advice on any withdrawal arrangements and on the applicable human rights standards. Finally, we note that the regulations also confer a duty on the Department of Education to prepare and publish a report on the implementation of relationship and sexuality education in Northern Ireland, and to lay this report before the Northern Ireland Assembly. The Commission will be consulted in preparation of this report, and as we highlight in our investigation report, monitoring is key to successful implementation. As the Northern Ireland Office have set out in their equality screening document, there was a divergence of views on the necessity of reforms to the Minimum Content Order. We are now able to move past that divergence, and we can now focus on what is necessary to ensure all children receive comprehensive RSE. Going forward, the Commission sees the publication of this report as a significant event in our exploration of RSE provision in Northern Ireland, but not as a conclusion. As we set out in our terms of reference, we had hoped to hold a number of roundtable discussions, but due to budgetary challenges, we were unable to move ahead with these plans. However, we anticipate that there will be active debate in coming months on the content of the Department of Education's guidance to schools, and we hope to actively participate in this debate and encourage all those who are doing so to review the human rights chapter, in particular in our report, that sets out the relevant standards. We also anticipate that following the return of the Northern Ireland Assembly, the Committee for Education and any Minister of Education will take a keen interest in our report and the question of implementation. I'm going to now hand over to Lauren, who will provide more detail on our report and the recommendations, and look forward to the Q&A.
Good morning, everyone. So as you're aware, the basis of our investigation was a recommendation that was made by the CEDAW Committee, which is the committee of experts who monitor state compliance with the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. The UK ratified CEDAW in 1986, and that ratification established their consent to be bound by the convention. In 2004, the UK then also acceded to the optional protocol to the convention, which at Article 8 empowers the CEDAW Committee to receive complaints and conduct inquiries to ascertain if systemic rights violations have occurred. In 2018, the CEDAW Committee published the report of its inquiry into sexual and reproductive health in Northern Ireland. The CEDAW report made a number of recommendations, and this investigation focuses on the recommendation that was set out at paragraph 86D of the report, which recommended that the UK Government and Northern Ireland Executive make age-appropriate, comprehensive and scientifically accurate education on sexual and reproductive health and rights a compulsory component of the curriculum for adolescents, covering prevention of early pregnancy and access to abortion. And as Colin has highlighted, these recommendations within the inquiry report were uniquely given domestic effect by the Northern Ireland Executive Formation Act 2019. Section 69 of the Northern Ireland Act 1998 empowers the Commission to conduct investigations and to compel evidence. The Commission commenced this investigation in October 2021, and we continue to gather evidence and reflect developments until the 31st of January 2023. The Commission, in line with Section 69D of the Northern Ireland Act, prepared a terms of reference which clarified the aims of our investigation, which were to identify the legal, policy and regulatory framework in Northern Ireland for the provision of RSE in schools, to identify the extent to which the human rights of children and young people to access age-appropriate, comprehensive and scientifically accurate RSE are realised in law, policy and practice, to identify good practice and make recommendations where necessary for improvement, and then to increase public awareness of human rights generally and specifically in the context of children's health education. Using our power of investigation, the Commission requested information from public bodies and community sector organisations who are involved in the delivery of RSE. The Commission then further wrote to post-primary schools in Northern Ireland and requested that they provide a copy of their RSE policies. An analysis of that will be discussed shortly. As we've outlined in our research report, the Commission has not observed the delivery of RSE in practice, and this investigation focuses primarily on the legal and policy framework governing the provision of RSE and is firmly grounded in international human rights standards. In conducting our analysis, we considered standards and recommendations from a number of UN and Council of Europe bodies. Within the report, you'll find a full analysis of each of these bodies. However, for this morning, rather than go through each of these individually, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the key themes that emerged relating to the provision of RSE. I'd like to clarify that this is not intended to suggest that the list of themes that we have raised are to be considered as an exhaustive list of what should be considered within RSE, but rather they're to provide an overview of the key elements that human rights bodies consider to be relevant to the provision of RSE. First of all, we noted that human rights bodies consider that RSE is essential to the fulfilment of a range of rights. So, for example, Grevio, which is the independent body that monitors compliance with the Istanbul Convention, has said that sexuality education for all boys and girls in schools is essential to guarantee women's sexual and reproductive health rights and is a full component of the rights to education and health. Secondly, we found that human rights bodies consider that schools should play an important role in the provision of RSE programmes and that RSE should be part of the mandatory school curriculum. So, for example, in addition to the CEDAW recommendations, we've noted that the UNCRC Committee, which monitors compliance with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, has said that the UK should ensure that meaningful sexual and reproductive health education is part of the mandatory school curriculum for all schools and in all areas of the state party. We also then found that the RSE curriculum should include scientifically based information regarding contraceptives and access to abortion services. So again, along with the recommendations that came out of the CEDAW inquiry, for example, the UN Human Rights Committee, which is the body that monitors the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has said that states should ensure access for girls and boys to quality and evidence-based information and education about sexual and reproductive health, and to a wide range of affordable contraceptive methods, and prevent the stigmatisation of women and girls seeking abortion. We then also found that comprehensive RSE has a role in preventing abuse and violence against women and girls, and promoting equality between women and men. So, for example, the Istanbul Convention at Article 14 requires states to take, where appropriate, the necessary steps to include teaching materials on issues such as equality between women and men, non-stereotype gender roles, mutual respect, gender-based violence against women, and the right to personal integrity. Next, we found that comprehensive RSE should contribute to effective safeguarding through raising awareness of the risks of sexual violence and abuse, and promoting an understanding of the importance of consent within relationships. So, for example, Article 6 of the Lanzarote Conventions requires states to take the necessary legislative or other measures to ensure that children during primary and secondary education receive information on the risk of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse, as well as on the means to protect themselves. We also found that comprehensive RSE should include information on harmful practices such as child, early and forced marriage, and female genital mutilation. So, for example, the UNESCO International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education has found that education programmes will be less effective if they omit key issues. For example, the sexual and reproductive health needs of young people living with disabilities or HIV, unsafe abortion, and harmful practices such as child, early and forced marriage, and female genital mutilation. Within that guidance, it also states that failure to discuss menstruation can contribute to the persistence of negative social and cultural attitudes towards it. Next, we found that RSE programmes should be non-judgmental and should take care not to reinforce harmful and demeaning stereotypes. Also, that specific consideration should be given to the experience of marginalised groups, including but not limited to LGBTQIA persons, disabled persons, and persons of national or ethnic minority background. So, for example, the CRPD Committee, which monitors compliance with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, in their general comment number 3, has raised concerns that women with disabilities may be denied access to information and communication, including comprehensive sexuality education, based on harmful stereotypes that assume they're asexual and therefore do not require this information on an equal basis with others. The European Committee on Social Rights, which monitors compliance with the European Social Charter, has also advised that RSE should not involve reinforcing demeaning stereotypes and perpetuating forms of prejudice which contribute to the social exclusion, embedded discrimination, and denial of human dignity often experienced by historically marginalised groups, such as persons of non-heterosexual orientation. Finally, we found that while the religious and philosophical beliefs of parents must be respected by the state within the education system, this should not interfere with the fundamental right of children to education. Much of the discussion in relation to the rights of parents focuses on Article 2 of the first protocol to the European Convention of Human Rights, which states that no person shall be denied the right to education, and that states shall respect the rights of parents to ensure that such education and teaching is in conformity with their own religious and philosophical convictions. Within our report, you'll find a more detailed analysis of the case law from the European Court of Human Rights in relation to Article 2 of the first protocol. The case law establishes that while the religious and philosophical beliefs of parents must be respected, the right of children to an education is a primary consideration. For example, the court has found that the second sentence of Article 2 must be read together with the first, which enshrines the right of everyone to education. It is onto this fundamental right that is grafted the right of parents to respect for their religious and philosophical convictions. We have noted that the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights has advised that it is important to take into account the communities and parents' cultural and religious backgrounds. Therefore, she advises that schools should be supported to engage with them including as appropriate with religious leaders, and take their views into account, provided that this does not contradict the very aims of sexuality education, the best interests of the child, or human rights standards. However, along with the views of the parents, it's also important to consider the views of children and young people and their right to participate in decisions that affect them. So, for example, the UNCRC committee has found that states should establish structures for the active and meaningful participation of children and give due weight to their views in designing laws, policies and programmes in relation to sexual and reproductive health education. So moving on to our findings in relation to school policies. In order for us to get an overview of RSE provision within schools, the Commission wrote to the 192 post-primary schools in Northern Ireland, and we requested that they provide a copy of their RSE policy, as well as a response to a questionnaire which asked the schools to provide more information on the delivery of RSE within schools, such as who it's delivered by and under which department. We also asked them whether they use external providers, as well as whether they use resources such as the SIA RSE Hub. In total, 149 schools responded to our questionnaire, with 124 providing copies of their RSE policies. Additionally, 42 schools provided copies of relevant materials, such as RSE PowerPoint lessons and teaching notes, and this accounted for a total of 210 additional educational resources. To assist in its assessment of the information that was gathered, the Commission appointed independent experts with specialist expertise and experience, and they analysed the materials and reported to the Commission with their findings. In summary, they found that the overwhelming majority of schools have established RSE policies. They found that a school's ethos plays a significant role in its approach to RSE, with 96.9% of schools referencing their ethos, morals or values in their RSE policy. However, they also found that 66.9% of schools also made reference to the need for RSE to be balanced and or unbiased. Of those schools who responded to the questionnaire, 94% responded that they use external providers to assist with the delivery of RSE, while 60.8% responded that they use the SIA RSE Hub resources. However, in relation to the use of the RSE Hub, it was found that the quantity and types of resources that were used vary greatly between schools. So, for example, one school stated that they use or plan to use all the SIA resources, while another stated that they merely use the Hub as a point of reference and do not make direct use of the materials. The independent experts then also provided a more detailed breakdown in terms of the approach to abortion, contraception, sexual orientation and gender identity, and gender relations and inequalities. And again, I'd like to highlight that this is not to suggest that RSE should be limited to those topics, but rather was to assess how some of the key topics are likely to be approached within schools. In relation to abortion, the experts assessed that based on the analysis of materials that were provided by schools, the majority of schools in Northern Ireland are not providing age-appropriate, comprehensive and scientifically accurate education on access to abortion services. They reported that 39.5% of schools did not reference abortion and related terms at all in their RSE policies, and that this points to a potential gap in information on abortion, as most policies outline the content of their curriculum, such as relationship skills or online safety. Of the 60.5% of schools that did make reference to abortion in their policies, only 26.6% did so in what was considered by our independent researchers to be an objective or value-free context. In these cases, some schools specifically described that the provision on information on abortion would be factual and objective, and others included abortion in science or biology classes, which may suggest teaching of abortion in a more factual manner. The majority of schools that mentioned abortion did so within a context of their school's ethos and moral framework, with a total of 65.3% of schools referencing various pro-life values. In relation to information on contraception, the independent analysis found that age-appropriate, comprehensive and scientifically accurate education on contraceptives and prevention of early pregnancy is being provided in at least some and possibly a majority of schools in Northern Ireland. 66.9% of schools reference contraception, family planning or STI and pregnancy prevention strategies within their RSE policies. Some schools explicitly express that they aim to provide factual information about different types of contraception. However, it was noted by the independent researchers that policies often promote abstinence and adopt a risk-focused approach. Some schools described how they would present their moral stance on contraception in addition to providing accurate information. For example, that the use of artificial means of preventing procreation is not acceptable. In relation to information on sexual orientation and gender identity, the independently contracted experts reported that while the majority of schools oppose bullying of various kinds within their RSE policies, this may not go far enough to achieve positive sexual health for young people who are LGBTQIA+. All but one school included a reference to sexual orientation and related terms within their RSE policies, and a smaller majority of 57.7% referenced gender identity. Most schools also made reference to young people's right to access education, with many mentioning the equal provision to students with different sexual orientations. In addition, the vast majority of schools also outlined their zero tolerance approach to homophobic, transphobic and queerphobic bullying or abuse. However, the analysis found that there were a number of contradictions in relation to LGBT issues, noting that most schools either explicitly or implicitly promoted heteronormativity in their RSE policies. Approximately 1/3 of schools explicitly stated that their school would teach pupils that heterosexual relationships were the main or ideal context for sexual intimacy, with some schools outlining their belief that same-sex relationships are wrong. Finally, approximately 1/3 of schools list sexual orientation and gender identity in their curriculum content, with very few schools referencing the legalisation of same-sex marriage in Northern Ireland. There are, however, some examples of schools that do demonstrate the inclusion of LGBTQ content in their RSE curricula. So, for example, one school wrote, "We wish to promote a positive view of sexual orientation and gender identity, which in turn can help to raise the self-esteem of LGBTQ pupils." The same policy further stated that they aim to provide pupils with LGBTQI inclusive relationships and sex education, opportunities to discuss sexuality, sexual orientation and gender identity, and including LGBTQI people and themes in the RSE, personal development and wider curriculum where relevant. In relation to gender inequalities and relations, positively, the analysis found that the majority of schools include references to teaching gender-related topics, such as gender stereotypes, gender equality and feminism within their policies. However, it was found that reference to tech-facilitated gender-based violence is largely absent. The analysis further highlighted that while 54% of schools teach young people strategies to protect themselves from sexual and other forms of violence and harassment, very few schools emphasise the importance of preventing others from perpetuating this violence. They did find an example of good practice in 3 schools whose policies outlined that it is also important that the pupils are encouraged to challenge the blame that can be attached to victims of sexual abuse and domestic or sexual violence in a relationship, particularly female victims, because of factors such as how they choose to dress or their alcohol intake. Finally, moving on to our recommendations. Our first 2 recommendations related to the reform of the minimum content order, which is now being implemented by the Secretary of State. Our second recommendation outlined that amendments should ensure that all elements of comprehensive RSE are delivered within every school, and that the necessary amendments to the minimum content order are sufficiently prescriptive to ensure this. We note that the amendment to the Education Order 2006 requires the Department of Education to develop guidance with a view to ensuring that education received by all pupils is age appropriate, comprehensive and scientifically accurate. In our third recommendation, we recommend that any such guidance should be developed following engagement with relevant stakeholders and experts to ensure that RSE programmes are inclusive and meet the educational needs of young people, including those with diverse gender and sexual identities, ethnic minority students and disabled students. In recommendation number 4, we note that the amendment to the minimum content order will require schools to update their RSE policy and that they should be supported to do so. In our fifth recommendation, we note that the ETI will play an important role in monitoring the implementation of the amendments to the Minimum Content Order, and therefore have recommended that their oversight arrangements, including engagement with children, are amended to reflect this. In recommendations 6 and 7, in line with recommendations from the CRC committee, we recommend that the implementation of the required amendments to the Minimum Content Order should be informed by the views and educational needs of young people, and that the Department of Education should support schools to include students in co-developing and evaluating their RSE policies. We recommend again that particular care is given to ensure engagement and consultation with students who may have particular needs, including those with diverse gender and sexual identities, ethnic minority students and disabled students. Our evidence gathering also indicated that further investment is needed to enhance the capacity of teachers, and therefore at recommendations 8 and 9, we recommend engagement with teachers by the Department for Education to invite their views on the support that they require to enable them to competently deliver RSE to post-primary school children and young people. And then we also recommend engagement with teacher training colleges in Northern Ireland to ensure that their programmes adequately train newly qualified teachers in the provision of RSE. The role of external providers in delivering RSE has been considered as part of this investigation. While a lack of teacher confidence may contribute to the dependence on external providers, we do also note that external providers may be equipped to provide specialist expertise on specific knowledge areas. However, this should not be an alternative to a permanent supportive presence in a school. The Commission therefore has recommended that the Department of Education develop additional guidance for schools on how to establish effective partnerships with external RSE providers, which should include guidance on ensuring that programmes and resources are compliant with international human rights standards. In the investigation report, you'll find an analysis of the resources within the SIA RSE Hub. There are many positive resources within the Hub, and we also note the development of the RSE progression framework. However, we have recommended that the resources are reviewed to ensure that they meet the requirements set out in the CEDAW Committee Recommendation 86D. As advised by the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, curriculum on sexuality education should be regularly evaluated and revised in order to ensure that they are accurate and meet existing needs. We've therefore recommended that the RSE curriculum is regularly evaluated and revised by the Department for Education in order to ensure that it is accurate, human rights compliant and adapting to emerging needs. Finally, the Commission recommended that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland put in place ongoing arrangements to monitor the effectiveness of any measures taken to bring about implementation of the CEDAW recommendation. And then finally, in line with our statutory functions, the Commission will continue to monitor any developments relating to the provision of RSE in post-primary schools, and the Commission has committed to publishing an assessment of progress against our recommendations in the summer of 2024.